This video is part of a series of interviews with some of the parachute engineers, scientists, and developers who have been responsible for the most significant and advanced parachute systems of the last half-century, and was created by the Aviation Trail Parachute Museum in Dayton, Ohio. In June 2017, at the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics Forum, Charles Lowry, longtime deceleration researcher and member of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, interviewed John Watkins about his work and accomplishments in the parachute industry.
Well, I'm pleased to be sitting here with my good friend, longtime friend, and professional friend, John Watkins. Tell us, John, about where you were born and where you live now.
I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and I live in Somers, Connecticut.
All the time since?
Oh, in between, and mostly in Connecticut and Massachusetts.
Okay.
Massachusetts for college, and most of my working life, and then I returned to Connecticut.
What was your education and where did you go to school?
I went to Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and I received a bachelor's in mechanical engineering, and then I was commissioned in the Army and went to various Army Ordnance Corps and advanced courses. So I've had an Army Reserve career in addition to my civilian career in parachutes.
Does that continue now?
No, I've retired.
Okay.
And so I don't have any association with the Army these days, but the Army experience was extremely helpful in working on Army parachute programs.
How did you get into parachutes in the first place?
Well, my first experience with parachutes was buying one for a bailout chute from an experimental glider that I built. Fortunately, I never did have to use that parachute. In my Army career, I was working with target drones, and they were recovered by parachutes, and the recovery rate was not that good. And I learned early on that parachutes are a lot more complicated than they look at first.
So that was your first involvement with the target drones, huh?
Right.
Then how did you advance from that into what you, other things?
I went to a ASME meeting where Bob Rodier gave a presentation on parachutes, and you know Bob, he worked for you, and at the end of that he said, "You're not looking for a job, are you?" And I said, "Well, in fact I am, because my company's moving down south. I like to downhill ski, so I think I'll stick in New England." And he said, "Come talk to us." So that...
And where was he?
He was at the US Army Natick Research Development and Engineering Center. So I went to work for Natick, and I spent 13 years there, and then another chance conversation let me switch to Pioneer. Pioneer asked me if I'd like to work for them, so I did, and I've spent the next 18 years at Pioneer.
And you're there now?
Yes, I still am.
Yes, okay. Well, the main places you worked then were, of course, your Army career, and then Natick, and then Pioneer. Were you,
Right,
or
those are the
any
three
other?
ones. I worked for a packaging machinery company where we put labels on bottles, and it kind of was like an amusement park for bottles. Mm-hmm. And where you twirl them around and slap labels on them and they come out the other side. It was mostly in the liquor industry. And
Was that before your education?
No, that was an engineering job. Okay. And then I worked for a company that made grinding machinery and heavy duty industrial grinding machinery, mostly for engine plants. It was in the automotive industry, was the main customer. And then I did have 2 years of active duty in the Army.
Well, during your career in the parachute biz, what are the best and most notable programs that you got to work on?
Well, there was a few, and strangely enough, they weren't the formal development programs. They were quick responses or transitioning technology from one area to another. And one example is humanitarian aid in Bosnia. During the Bosnian crisis in the early 90s, they were airdropping a lot of food and supplies to people that needed it, but they ran out of the high velocity parachutes that they were using to drop those supplies. And they said, we need you to adapt a much bigger parachute to match the ballistics of that high velocity parachute that we were using, and it needs to be employed in just a few weeks. So because of my work with instrumentation techniques, I was able to develop a plan to conduct just one or two tests to demonstrate the ballistics, that we matched the ballistic with this much larger parachute that had been reefed to a much smaller diameter. And I worked with our Army riggers at Natick to come up with a simple, non-sewing way to put a permanent reefing line into the parachute, because these parachutes were making a one-way trip. They would never be recovered. And we went to Yuma Proving Ground, and we essentially made two test weights, two test containers, and we pushed them off the airplane at the exact same time. And I figured if they hit the ground at the same time and place, we matched the ballistic. And because of that, we were able to remove the need to do weeks and weeks of ballistic testing just by using that comparative test technique.
Yeah.
And that was one of the ones that I really liked. And then on the crew escape system for the Space Shuttle, the designers determined that they needed a high-speed drogue to decelerate the astronauts. And we had one ready-made because I'd been working at China Lake with a high-speed special operations parachute that was to be deployed at 250 knots. And the drogue from that was able to be transferred into the Space Shuttle crew escape system. And I think it helped get that system ready to go sooner than it ordinarily would. And then during the first Gulf War, they were using these large bombs called daisy cutter bombs, 15,000-pound bomb, and they ran out of the parachutes that they used to decelerate those. And it was the same thing as in the Bosnia. I had to take an existing parachute, reef it down so it matched the ballistics, and those were used a few times over there.
Very good. Tell me what kind of the big technical challenges did you run into along the way, either in those events or any other things you worked on?
One of the things is test and instrumentation. Testing is almost always the most expensive part of parachute development. It takes the longest. And so I've always put a lot of emphasis on developing test techniques that allow precise measurements and at low cost and fewest numbers of tests. And that throughout my career I've always kind of tended towards emphasizing that.
How about the proudest moment in your career? You mentioned a couple of very proud ones. Are there any others that you?
Yes, graduating from airborne school. I was able to attend airborne school. I It was one of these chances that doesn't come along very often. The three-star general, who was the commander of Army Material Command, was asking us about parachutes, and he said, do you jump out of airplanes? And I saw a very narrow window of opportunity, and I said, no, sir. And he says, well, don't you think you should if you're designing personnel parachutes? And I said, yes, sir. And he says, well, how come you don't? And I said, people have stopped us from going to airborne school. And he says, well, I just don't see that as a very big problem, and to a three-star general, maybe it wasn't. So the next thing we know, we're off to airborne school. And
While you're employed at Natick?
While I was employed at Natick, and I was twice the age of the guy standing next to me. And but we went through airborne school just like everybody else. And it's probably one of the more beneficial things that I did, because it doesn't matter how smart you are about parachutes. If you haven't walked the walk, it's tough to talk the talk. And I found that at Fort Bragg and other places, people were skeptical about what you had to say until they knew that we had gone to airborne school and joined their club. And then they were very receptive, and it helped so much in my career.
Tell me who you enjoyed working with so much, and who do you most admire that you've worked with?
Well, Bob Rodier, who hired me, is probably the best example of a boss, and even more a mentor. And throughout my career, I have tried to emulate the way that he managed his tasks. And another person that I enjoy working with, who I'm working with right now, is Roy Fox. He's just the absolute professional. He deals with customers as good as anyone I've ever seen. He works harder than anyone I've ever seen. And he's just great to work with. And as you know, he's a fellow Kanaki Award winner.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he's the only one who is not a degreed engineer who got that award, which is quite an accomplishment.
It is. Tell me how, when you first got into the business and did things a certain way, how was that versus how you do things today as a parachute engineer?
It's, in the early days, there wasn't so much computing capability, and there wasn't emails and all those things. And nowadays, I spend a lot more time at the desk typing emails and things like that. For the most part, it's a benefit because I can do a lot more engineering and calculating than I could when I entered in the business. You know, when I entered in it, it wasn't quite the slide rule stage. We'd advanced beyond that, but personal computers were just coming on board in the government. So there's been a lot of advances in the computing and communication field, but to some extent it's a double-edged sword.
How about what innovations have you observed through your career and maybe even participated in?
Well, I found that in the parachute business, you have some enabling technologies. For example, in the early days, nylon instead of silk and other natural fibers. And more recently, there's a lot of guided and gliding wing-type parachutes, parafoils, and those would not have been possible without the development of lower porosity fabrics. So it's kind of a stepping stone where, you know, the technical advances can't happen until you have the materials advances. And of course, with the guided parafoils and things like that, you have to have the guidance technology, and that wouldn't really be possible without GPS.
Mm-hmm. What kind of breakthroughs would you most like to see happen in the near future?
Well, I don't know if it would be a breakthrough, but I would like to see less expensive testing, because that seems to be the limitation of most parachute programs. It's the cost of conducting the testing. And then if you're not careful, the measurements are ambiguous or misleading. So accurate measurements and lower cost testing. And I know that I've done a lot of work in adapting low cost instrumentation. I take instrumentation that's used in model airplanes and used it in many, many parachute tests, and that's a fraction of the cost of the more traditional instrumentation.
What lessons has your work life taught you?
I've learned to treat people with respect, and like I said, I tried to emulate my first boss, Bob Rodier, and my guiding principle is I would rather have people work with me because they wanted to than work for me because they had to. And I've always tried to run my projects that way, and I haven't been a direct supervisor of most of the people that have worked for me or outside organizations. If you want good cooperation from outside organizations, you have to operate that way. And so that's the main thing from the work.
Tell us about your immediate family.
Well, the only thing I'll say there is I'm just so grateful for my father for giving me good guidance on the way that you should operate, and honesty and professionalism, and then my mother for her emphasis of good grace and principles.
Wonderful. Tell me, we talked about your work life lessons learned. What about your non-work life lessons learned that you apply to your...
Well, what I've found is there's many, many opportunities, no matter how well you plan your life. A lot of opportunities come up suddenly, and there's a very narrow window of opportunity, and you have to make a quick decision as to whether you're going to do that or not. Going to airborne school, even working in parachutes at all, that was just a very quick, I had about 5 minutes to make a decision as to what I was going to do. So many life-changing events are these quick opportunities that you have to take advantage of or not.
Are there any other things that we should talk about that your life reflects? Anything we didn't cover?
Well, I'd like to relate a story about an early trip that I made with Bob Rodier, John Kiker, and Theo Kanaki. We went to Fort Bragg to consult with the Army on new personnel parachutes, and we went to dinner one night, and it was really amazing. And Theo and John Kiker just seemed to have the most fun of anyone I'd ever seen, and that's when I decided that the best career path was a technical one and get to be fairly known that way, because when you're retired, you could have a lot of fun doing interesting consulting work. So I stayed more towards the technical end of things than the management end of things. And that kind of kept me in the parachute industry, but it's been a lot of fun, and I've met a lot of interesting people. And I'll relate one funny story that we had at that conversation that night. We were all talking about ways that parachutes tests had been canceled, and someone said, well, it got really windy one day and we couldn't drop. And someone said, well, the airplane broke, so we couldn't drop. And then I thought I was going to top them all when I said, well, I was in Alaska and a volcano erupted, so we couldn't drop because they grounded all the airplanes. And I thought that was going to be the top. And then Theo came up and he said, That's nothing. I had a parachute test canceled because they shot down the drop aircraft. So you couldn't really top that.
That's very good. John, well, we appreciate so much talking to you. You've been my friend so long, and that continues.
The Aviation Trail Parachute Museum in Dayton, Ohio, tells the story of the development of the freefall parachute from its invention at Dayton's McCook Field after World War I, through the vital role the parachute plays today in the decelerator industry and safely landing spacecraft. The museum includes interactive exhibits, artifacts, historic photographs, and films. Aviation Trail Incorporated has developed a self-guided tour of select aviation-related sites that are open to the public in the Dayton area. Aviation Trail's mission is to preserve and promote the Dayton area's unique aviation heritage, beginning with the invention of the airplane by Wilbur and Orville Wright. Find out more at aviationtrailinc.org.